Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Shot. Thanks for sharing your Sunday morning with us, or Sunday afternoon, or whenever you may be watching it. Here we are broadcasting from the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the mighty Eora Nation. So this week, Dave is still traipsing around Europe, so will not be joining us as co-host. Do join us next week, though, where he is going to be beaming in from Europe. We're going to have a bit of a Europe focus next week. But today, it is going to be all about the chaos which is engulfed I think we can still say the coalition as of this moment, but who knows what the status is from minute to minute. Um, I'm joined by some very eminent panelists today who are going to give us the benefit of their expertise. Frank Bongiorno is an historian and academic and author from ANU. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Joe. Nice to be here.
Yeah, his most recent book, I have to say, is a magisterial account of political history from pre-invasion Aboriginal society to present day, entitled Dreamers and Schemers, and it contains everything you ever wanted to know about Australia's political history. So I highly recommend that.
Thanks, Joe.
Emeritus Professor of La Trobe University, Judith Brett, is here with us. Now, Judy, you've just launched your most recent book literally in the last couple of weeks, I think, about seminal feminist and co-founder of the women's electoral lobby, Beatrice Faust, Fearless Beatrice Faust, Sex, Feminism and Body Politics. So thank you for joining us. And lastly, we have Julianne Schultz, who's the founding editor of the Griffith Review, which many of you will know, and currently professor at Griffith University's Centre for Social and Cultural Research. And her most recent book, published just after the 22 election, is The Idea of Australia, A Search for the Soul of the Nation. So thank you to the three of you for joining us after such a tumultuous week in Australian politics. Now, Laura Tingle did say in her column this week that why are we spending so much time obsessing about what have become almost two minor fringe parties, following on from just the thumping result of the election a couple of weeks ago. And we should be focusing perhaps more on what Albanese is going to do with his second term. And there is some truth in that, I think, and we are going to spend a little bit of time on Albanese and the next couple of weeks at the end. But I do think it does behove us to look at what is going on with the coalition, because it is an organisation of the political parties here in Australia which has stood them and to arguably Australia in good stead for decades. And it seems to have just been blown up uh, on a whim, and an ill thought through whim at that. Frank, I think it's fair to say that the junior coalition party in the Nationals has really, from the start, exercised disproportionate influence on the management of the centre-right parties in this country. Can you take us back to the origins of the coalition and how it came to be, and how the circumstances of its formation then, if you like, played a role in the way that it's worked for the decades since?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, the Nationals were, of course, originally the Country Party, and they emerged essentially out of the First World War. They sort of appeared in different states at different times, quite early in Western Australia and so on. But basically, coming out of the First World War, um, and in a lot of ways, a kind of offshoot of the party that was then really called, well, Liberals, then the Nationalists. Gets confusing, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
the sort of predecessor of the Liberals was called the Nationalists, but um, and yeah, devoted very much to the interests of the bush, and I guess to bringing all of the benefits of modernity to country people. I mean, this is a time when car ownership is beginning to expand, when electrification is taking off, and I guess from a rural perspective, it looked like those kinds of things could be enjoyed by people in the cities, in the major metropolitan cities, but the country people would miss out. So it sort of emerged out of that. The coalition tradition, again, has quite a patchy history. So nationally, in federal politics, it emerged in early 1923 after an election that was held late in 1922. And yes, as you point out, the Country Party did exact a very heavy price. It managed to tip out the Prime Minister of the day as one of the conditions for joining a coalition. That was Billy Hughes. And it got, 5 ministries, I think, in that first cabinet out of 11, which was very disproportionate, including, of course, Treasury in those days. And in fact, the Country Party, held the Treasury, at least up to about the 1950s, when Arthur Fadden was Treasurer in the 1950s. So, look, they've generally been a very influential force. They shared a lot of ground, though, it has to be said, with their more senior partner, the Liberals, over the years. The classic period of the coalition was really the Menzies era, I think, the 1950s and 1960s, when they were really riding high on the back of great rural prosperity after the Second World War. And I think, that in some ways, since the 1970s, they've found the going more difficult in a lot of ways, in obviously a society and economy that's changed enormously. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, and there were quite a few sort of agrarian parties that formed around this time across the world. And it
Mm.
does actually seem to be that by entering into this sort of formal arrangement and negotiating terms of access to government and power, they were able to ensure their own survival in ways that some of those
Mm.
regionally focused parties did not in years to come.
Yeah, they are the great survivor, and there are a lot of agrarian parties around the world that came and went. And interestingly, the coalition option wasn't taken in every part of Australia. I mean, a really interesting exception, and I would have thought a very big one, was Victoria, where in state politics in general, until Kennett came along, Jeff Kennett, the Country Party had maintained a very independent existence. So, the long-standing kind of Victorian equivalent of the Menzies government, the Bolte government, was a Liberal government. It wasn't a coalition government at all. And in fact, in Victoria, there was even traditions of the Country Party propping up Labor governments. Sorry, the other way around. Well, yes, they did that. But more commonly, the other way around, Labor Party propping up minority Country Party governments. So there have been different arrangements in different places. In Queensland, of course, the Country Party was the senior partner,
Mm.
and then Joh Bjelke-Petersen discarded them in the 1980s, discarded the Liberals and governed alone until his fall. So you've had different arrangements in Australia, but certainly the coalition, sort of tradition in New South Wales, eventually in Victoria, and especially federally, I think has been enormously beneficial to the National Party, and probably does help to account for their longevity.
I mean, we'll come to Queensland because it's kind of a separate case in some ways, because, as you point out, it was the only state where they were consistently the senior party in the arrangements of the coalition. And I wonder if some of the issues which we see now is because there is this idea, hubristic as it may be, that it's unfair that they've been relegated to junior status. But generally, across the last few decades of the coalition arrangements, Judy, there has been um, really strong personalities, the heavy hitters, if you like, of the coalition. And I'm thinking people like Doug Anthony and Ian Sinclair, and people who, through sheer kind of gravitas, if you like, have managed to play an important role in the coalition, in a way which is perhaps dates back to Blackjack McEwen and the influence that he could have. And indeed, again, he was another personality who was able to have, well, basically decide who was going to be prime minister, or who wasn't going to be prime minister after the disappearance of Holt.
Yeah, I think that the Fraser government, which is when we see Doug Anthony and Sinclair, is the last really high point of the coalitions working together. And remember, Fraser was a farmer. He represented Wannon, which was essentially a rural electorate, and there's always been rural Liberal representatives. Not the country party's strength was in the area where there were small farmers and settlements. Some of the areas with the bigger pastoral properties stayed Liberal. But two things I think happened after the Fraser period, which introduced new tensions into the coalition. The first was the embrace by the Liberals of neoliberalism. The Nationals, or the Country Party, we used to talk about Country Party socialism. They were never that keen on neoliberalism, and they fought quite hard against, for example, the privatisation of telecom. Because the country had very much relied on state-delivered services for the sorts of things that Frank was talking about, particularly infrastructure. And the second, more recently, since 2000, has been the issues around climate change. And they've both introduced, I think, really serious tensions into the coalition agreement, which are partly what we've seen the consequences of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it is interesting the way that you have seen, though, the National Party kind of grappling with, climate change denialism, really, and the focus which has moved, and Tony Windsor talks a little bit about this in his interview, the way that the focus has changed from supporting farmers and agrarian policy to much more about mining and extractive industries. But we can perhaps come to that a bit later. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Fraser's government, as you point out, is Fraser, his thumping majorities, he didn't actually need the coalition. And same with Howard later, but he decided that there was a value that was drawn from that, having that bridge between the regional urban divides and keeping the coalition in the tent, as it were. Julianne, I think that kind of wisdom of the elders, if you like, from within the Liberal Party is something that I think gave a lot of weight to the coalition and the arrangements around it.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, I think the other more recent instance, which I think has started to re-scramble the nature of the relationship, was obviously the election of Pauline Hanson in 1996, and her exclusion then from the Liberal Party initially for her letter saying it's not fair, they're getting stuff that we're not, which was sufficient in those days to see her kicked out of the Liberal Party. But it meant that in her electorate, which was one of the safest Labor electorates in the country, there's a 20% swing to her. And I think that was a huge wake-up call for both the Libs and the Nats. And certainly in a Queensland sense, what that meant, 2 years later, the Libs were basically wiped out in the Queensland State Parliament. The One Nation won about 11 seats, and Peter Beattie sort of came in through a deal with independents. And that really then set up the sort of formal process of trying to begin the process of combining the Libs and Nats in Queensland. And so where you had a reasonably progressive, small L Liberal type party that actually exercised a lot of, had control in Brisbane for a start, but also had a lot of influence in terms of the sort of economic development of Queensland, which was much more sophisticated than it looks from the outside when you just think corruption and so on. I mean, there was a lot of very clever stuff that was done during that period. And that was really in the hands of the Nats. So by 1998, when the Libs are basically wiped out, you've got John Howard running around saying, there's a whole lot of actions against Pauline Hanson, obviously, but Howard in his sort of willingness to say, oh, well, I don't agree with what she says, but I welcome her opportunity to say it, effectively gave a license to that set of values and those sorts of views. And I think what you've seen is the Liberal Party's increasingly tried to absorb that right-wing flank. It's most pronounced in the Queensland party, where has been combined now for, since 2008 or so. And it's been pretty, it hasn't been hugely productive. I mean, they won this last election. They won one before that got the Brisbane City Council. But it's not been a really successful sort of partnership, judged by the sort of metrics of old. But what it has done is it's really gone into the sort of the value set and what the, you know, how you would actually describe the parties. And so I think that when you've got a leadership, you know, as there was with Dutton and Littleproud, both coming out of the LNP, you're sort of screwing, you know, you're twisting the sort of axis of power that has traditionally existed, which was much more, you know, much more Melbourne, Sydney and so on, and pulled it into Queensland. And it's a Queensland that's been distorted by the fear of One Nation. And, you know, let's face it, I mean, One Nation got more votes than the National Party in the first preferences in this past election. LNP got double the number of votes that the Nats got, you know, nationally. So you're actually talking about a party which is really the tail that's trying to wag the dog. And let me tell you, those Queenslanders, you know, there's nothing like a chip on a shoulder to bring a bit of hubris in when they feel like they've got the numbers.
Well, talking about the tail wagging the dog out of Queensland, Frank, I mean, it was the last great schism in the coalition came because of the activities of the Queenslanders and the quixotic campaign to get Joe Bjelke-Petersen to Canberra, first for PM, and then they sort of modified it slightly when it didn't look like they had the broad support to get him elevated to that degree. And that failure there and the rupture of the coalition then led to a lot of three-cornered, you know, contests and basically sort of the wipeout of the re-election of the Hawke government there. So tell us a little bit about that. And then I guess, as Julianne points out, the way that activity led to, in years to come, the merging. And then we can talk a little bit about how that's played out, drawing on Julianne's comments.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Quixotic's one word for it, I guess. I often reach for crazed, mad, a whole range of those. I mean, it was a great irony, wasn't it, that it was based on this, I guess, sense of that chip on the shoulder about Queensland that Julianne was just talking about. And yet it was this kind of ambition to make the whole country like Queensland, really, the Joe for PM business. And, you know, its nursery, of course, was, I think, a corrupt National Party government in Queensland, governing alone by that stage without whatever restraint the Liberals had been able to impose earlier. With a big win in the 1986 state election. John Howard and Jeanette Howard were apparently watching it on telly, and John Howard apparently turned to her and said, "We're going to get trouble from this lunatic now." And he was quite right. I mean, it basically destroyed whatever chance the coalition had of winning the 1987 federal election under John Howard. The coalition broke under the impact of that Queensland disruption. There was still under the counter quiet cooperation going on between the Liberals and the New South Wales Nationals, of course, who were under Ian Sinclair at that stage, but it gave the impression of chaos. Bjelke-Petersen himself was forced into a kind of humiliating retreat when Bob Hawke, surprise, surprise, had a look at what was going on amongst his opponents and called an early election, you know, with the economy improving. There are interesting parallels with today in the sense that I think one of the things that drove the Joe for PM fiasco, really, or debacle, was a centrist Labor Party in Canberra and a Labor Party in Canberra that, quite frankly, didn't look as threatening to Queenslanders as Whitlam had. And it led to all sorts of bizarre misjudgments, I think, of the kind that we've seen over the last week, also being driven to some extent from Queensland. Yeah, look, interesting parallels. It was quite quick. It was quick and dirty in the sense that it was, you know, once they'd lost the election, differences were sort of patched up. But of course, the bitterness, well, in some ways, I think you could say it lasts down to this day, for years afterwards anyway, and incredibly disruptive to the to centre-right politics, and really helped the Labor Party to another, what was it, about 9 years, 8 or 9 years in office. Yeah.
Judy, sorry, go.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that was happening during the 1980s is the Nationals, if we think of them, you know, as a sectoral party, they were very used to being at the seat of government. So all of a sudden, they haven't. They've got no access to government at all, but they still have these interests that they need to represent. And it's interesting, I think, that during that period, the National Farmers Federation rises to prominence, and it has to stay non-partisan in a way. It has to be like there's a Labor government, there's Labor Party in power. That farmers and regional interests still need representing in some way, and when they're not in coalition. So I think that was also destabilizing what the coalition, and I think that's part of what we're seeing now. It's like out of power, the rural interests are still, they're still an important part, particularly of our export earnings. They're going to need some way of talking to the Labor Party in government. And so I think what we'll see is things like the National Farmers Federation and perhaps other organisations becoming more prominent. And this makes to an extent, the National Party becomes sort of irrelevant to the interests that it's representing.
It's interesting you say that, Judy, because you think about the role of the National Farmers Federation, like during the sort of the Wick and Mabo process, when Richard Harley was running it. I mean, it was very much about trying to find accommodations, and it wasn't about the old way of dealing with things, that you're either in this club or you're not. That there was actually a shared interest, which was very much the view that was promoted then, and subsequently by other leaders of the National Farmers Federation in terms of climate change. But that then doesn't translate through into the into the National Party policies. I think that one of the things that's really important is just keeping the economic change in mind in all of this. Like in the early days when agriculture was the driver of the national economy, very largely, you needed that party. Agriculture is now, it's important, but it's a very minor player, and it needs much less labour. It's very much changed model than what it was, in that post-war period. And I mean, what Queensland was ahead of the game with, and WA as well, but obviously it's different traditions there, was that Queensland had been strong to some degree in agriculture, but not in the way that New South Wales and Victoria were. It was big, big farm, big cattle farms and things like that, not the intensive agriculture that you'd seen in the other states. And so what Queensland did much earlier was move to that mining economy. And that then changed the sort of whole rationale of the National Party from being something very much grounded in that working on the land, living on the land, being in regional communities, to being dealing with a part of Australia which is very much changed, where you've got fly-in, fly-out workers, you've got towns that pop up and then disappear. You've got huge international interests in terms of the mining and so on. And so it's a very different they're dealing with a very different economic frame than was there in the period, for instance, that Frank was talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, Julianne, I think that's really interesting. In a lot of ways, the foundation of Yockey Peterson's power was the coal mining in the Bowen Basin and so on, and the sheer the lucrative nature of that for government in terms of government receipts. The impression was, of a kind of hayseed government, but coal was central to it, and it is, as you say, it's hard not to see the ways in which that's flowed into a broader set of changes in who the National Party represents, in which Queenslanders and Queensland are so important. It's worth keeping in mind where Barnaby Joyce's career began. Okay, It's easy to think of him as a New South Wales bloke, but that's not where, he was originally, but that's not where it began in terms of his political career, and I think that's important too in all this. Yeah.
But I think also important when we think about mining, the National Party and the Country Party before it has to have geographically concentrated support. And that once happened with farming, and even though there's fly-in and fly-out workers, there's mining towns. It provides that same geographical concentration when actually, in terms of the national vote, they get a pretty small amount.
And I think the other thing which is sort of just interesting in terms of the land use stuff, you talk about the Bowen Basin, Frank. What that signalled was the end of underground coal mining and the beginning of that open cut stuff. And that's now introduced sort of an environmental dimension, both in Queensland but also in the Hunter and other places where those vast mines, that just destroy, vast tracts of land and are meant to be rehabilitated, but, don't
never are.
Do it. That sort of changes that sort of emotional tie in a way, which the National Farmers Federation, I think, still very much represents, that sort of emotional tie to the land as a productive resource.
We might go to the interview with Tony Windsor now, and then we can sort of talk some more about the issues that he raises when we come back. This will run for about 15 minutes. Just going to... And off we go. Tony Windsor, thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
A pleasure, Joe. Good to meet you.
After the kind of big announcement on Tuesday that the coalition would be no more, we've now heard that there are peace talks going on. Where do you think the Nationals are at this moment?
Well, I think, like the rest of the world, they're very confused about where their future is, and so they should be. The appalling result in the election for the coalition. The Nationals would argue that they held on to their seats, so it wasn't their fault, and this is one of the motivating factors in terms of the split. But a lot of what happened in the cities for Dutton was, in my view at least, engaging with national-style politics, some of it Trumpian, being directed by Dutton. I've really forgotten his name already.
Well, may as well put it from your mind.
A lot of that was being pushed by the National Party, and Peter Dutton was accepting of that. The other thing I think too that made a significant difference was the uniting with One Nation in the last week of the election campaign as well. Now that would have been pressure from the Nats, and obviously the polling was saying that they were in big trouble. We've got to do everything we possibly can to try and claw some of this back. So I think even though the Nats held their position to a certain extent, their activities in terms of the policy formation was one of the major reasons for the coalition failing at the election. So I don't think they can just walk away and spit the dummy and say, well, Susan, it's up to you now. You fix it, and we might come back and have lunch one time.
I mean, there's probably two things that come out of that. The first, just on the One Nation issue, I mean, you had real kind of heroes, lions, if you like, of the National Party, like Ron Boswell, who really dedicated the last period of his political career to ensuring that One Nation did not get a toehold amongst the national voters, and taking very principled position about preferences. And you really saw this election that just being thrown out the window.
All of the activity during the campaign, that was the thing that really shone out to me. That how can you do that given the history, not only of the National Party, of the coalition itself? It was Tony Abbott many years ago now that actually was behind jailing Hanson in a sense. Howard, Boswell, you mentioned it, many others, Tim Fisher, all of those people, the National Party elders and Liberal elders were saying that this person is no good, this party is no good for the long-term running of the nation. I mean, One Nation in this sense. So there was a unity ticket on that, and all of a sudden we see One Nation, in that, particularly in the last week, but in the last few months, there's been interaction between the Nationals and the Liberals and One Nation in terms of policy formation, trying to find that conservative way to garnering votes wherever they can. So all that's blown up. And now we see within a week the National Party itself under Littleproud saying, oh no, we went okay, well, we're out of town now and you can take the blame. Well, I don't think that's gone down terribly well, and I think that's one of the reasons why, and I say again, this was recording on Thursday, why they've reconvened some peace discussions. I would imagine that the funders of the National Party, the big backers, have been making phone calls and saying, you guys might have some say in terms of the parliamentary party, but you don't own the party. We do. We think you should reconsider this, because it's obvious to everybody that if they stay split, they will not be in a position to form government, and that will empower Albanese and the Labor Party, obviously, for the future.
Ben Rowie from the Tally Room had done an interesting post where he talked about the Nationals always like to run the line that they've held their position. All the seats that they hold are relatively safe, with the exception that some independents might be coming up behind them, and we can get onto that. So that there really isn't much room for fluctuation of their seats. They have a fairly stable area that they represent, fairly stable number of seats. So they're not subject to the vagaries of the swings in quite the same way that the Liberals are now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They are back to a fairly solid rump of fairly solid supporters. But, well, given the history of New England, for instance, those supporters will move if they find someone that they can vote for. And I think what the Nats might be opening up by doing this, if in fact the split remains, is that a good Liberal in a seat like New England or a good independent would have a chance of winning. Obviously, the seats you're talking about and Roe was talking about was they're not national, they're not Labor seats. Labor will never win, so someone else may. So if it gets down to three-quartered contests, you may well see good Liberal candidates standing in those seats and making a difference. But the substantive point he's making is quite correct. When you look at what those seats actually get in terms of largesse, when the coalition are in Parliament, when the Nationals are at the desk and have some say at the table, they get very little because they're safe. Why bother? We just ignore them. They'll always be there. And that's the real problem that the Nationals have got long term. They've ignored that substantive base. And if the right people come along, it'll blow apart. I've got no doubt about that.
So the Nats are trying to characterise this split as being about policy, principally. You know, they've got their list of 4 policy issues, starting with nuclear. And I don't remember nuclear power always being one of the key principles of the Nationals. They do seem to have, in recent years, moved from a broad representation of the farmers and the people of the bush to much more lobbyists and advocates for the mining industry. And some of that may well be to do with the backers that you talked about. How and why do you think that evolution has happened on the policy front? And what impact do you think it has on the traditional agrarian voters from the bush?
Well, money is the key, where they've been getting their money from. Some people say, the National Party has always been the farmers' party. Well, there's about 100,000 farmers left in Australia now. So there's not even one electorate. There's country people, might be related to farmers or farming backgrounds, all those things. But it's never really been the farmers' party. It's been a country party in that sense. But the money is with the mining sector. No doubt about it. And that's what politics is about, not only during the process of being in politics, but after it. And there's a whole range of examples of people who finish politics and then go into well-paid jobs because of their skills, no doubt. But
indeed, of course.
So there's this linkage that's there now. And I think what's happening right now is that some of those people are picking up the phone and saying, we've got to fix this. We don't people like Albanese there for a Menzian period. So let's start to talk to Susan Ley again and see if we can rectify it. But you mentioned the point of nuclear. That's never been there before. In fact, they were anti-nuclear some years back when there were threats of nuclear power plants being put in country areas. They stood up for the country to say, no, we don't want the risk of these things. But on the policy front, and David Littleproud, from what I've heard him say, it's very shallow stuff. He's saying there's 4 points that we can't come to an agreement with, and they're policy points. Nuclear is one of them. I think one was Telstra.
Mobile phone coverage.
Mobile phone coverage. Well, the Nationals were the ones 20 odd years ago now that actually gave Howard the numbers to sell out on the third tranche of Telstra. But Howard actually gave the National Farmers Federation president, a bloke called Peter Corrish at the time, an undertaking that there would be an entitlement for country people to have equity of access in terms of price and service, and that would be enshrined in legislation. Barnaby Joyce, who was a young senator at the time, he actually said, "Well, that's good enough for me. We can sell it." A lot of people won't remember any of this, but it was sold. It was never enshrined in legislation that country people would get a fair go. And now we have the same people who destroyed it, or when they had the opportunity, they're back again in opposition, talking about a policy mix which will reinstate the equity of access at service and price. Now, this is the modus operandi of these people. Then they've never been about constructive things for country people. They want the problem so that they can prey on that problem when they're in opposition. They had 9 years, nearly 10 years in government recently, and all of these issues weren't there then.
Well, indeed, their failure to deal with mobile phone coverage is actually what led to the community independence movement in the first place, with Catherine McGowan campaigning hard on that.
The whole thing is a shambles. One of the other things that he says, this is David Littleproud, says, we want to stand up for the future fund. We want this future fund that they're talking about, $20 billion to country people for childcare and all these other activities. When did he start to talk about that? I think it was about 3 days out from the Saturday of the election. Now, they knew, as I did, because I've still got mates in the National Party who can tell me things occasionally, but they knew then they'd lost. They'd lost the election. So what have we got to do? Throw out all this stuff, these wild promises that you haven't got to deliver, but they'll be handy after the election in opposition to say, oh, you've got to keep supporting us because the filthy Labor Party won't put in place our $20 billion. And now they're saying the filthy Liberal Party won't put in place their $20 billion. So it's almost farcical, the 4 reasons that they've given.
Do you think, given how flimsy those reasons are, do you think that part of the manoeuvrings here from some of the more conservative members like Canavan and so on is that they genuinely see that they could become the major conservative opposition to Labor? Do they have that kind of hubris, or is it more personality and going through the entrails after a major defeat?
Oh, I think there's a lot of that, and they're following some of their funders.
Yeah,
I won't get into names, but most people that are watching this will know where a lot of their money's coming from. They're following those sort of doctrines. They actually believe in some of the Trumpian type style of things. They think it will be popular to a majority of people. Now, if one lesson came out of Saturday fortnight ago, it was that Australians won't accept that nonsense. They won't accept Trump-style stuff and this sort of fantasy glades policy mix. It's all aimed at today and tomorrow and next week, never the real future for our children, etc. So I think they've been trapped in this sort of sky after dark environment. Someone needs to go in there with a torch and just show them how to get out of there, because that's about 8 or 10% of the vote. Now, that might be where this will all stop. If they in fact remain split, they'll end up with a few people sitting over on one side that are, well, they have virtually crossbenchers by then. But in terms of their power as an opposition, they won't be part of it, and neither should they with this sort of nonsense that they've been carrying on with.
And just finally, what do you think this all then means for the re-elected Albanese government, with the rabble going on the opposite side now, potentially for the medium term? Who is going to be holding him and his government to account?
Well, there's some very good independents in there to start with, and I think if Albanese is smart, they will take advantage of this opportunity and actually start to give policy real debate in the parliament. Just because they've got the numbers and they think they can just ram things through, that'd be the silliest things they can do. If they engage with the crossbench in the lower house, it puts the Liberal Party in a position where they really have to start thinking about policy, and that really applies pressure back on the Nats. As to we just can't, be running our fantasy glade stuff. We've got to have some substance in terms of the policy. But if Albanese does that, and I'll just finish on an old National Party stalwart rang me the other day after the announcement that they'd had a divorce, and he said to me, "Do you want my view of the future?" This is a fellow who used to dislike me immensely. "Do you want my view of the future?" I said, "Oh yeah, give it to me." He said, "It's 2040. Prime Minister Jim Chalmers has just announced his retirement after 4 terms as Prime Minister, and Leader of the Opposition, Bob Catter, has thanked him for his service." That's what will happen if these people don't wake up to themselves and actually realise that it's not about them, it's about the people that are out there, and they should start to address that rather than listening to the Sky After Dark nonsense.
So there we go. That's Tony's talking truth to power. A lot in there, I think, that we can talk about. I think one of the things that I found interesting about the way that Littleproud's approached his negotiations, such as they were with Susan Lee, was to put such a premium on policy that, as Tony alluded to, had not always played a particularly significant role throughout the campaign. They suddenly seemed to come the hills that they were going to die on, when Susan Lee's position was, well, in the first instance, the way that we hammer out the coalition agreement isn't about policy. It's about the arrangements in Parliament. It's about sharing the front bench position, so on and so forth. Julianne, it's always been interesting because we, the Australian population, have never really had insight into what the hell goes into the coalition agreements. It is secret deal that they strike, for which there is no accountability.
I know it's an amazing turnabout. I mean, for years we've been told no, the party coalition agreement is confidential to the parties and it can't ever be seen and there's no discussion and you don't need to know what's in there because we're not going to tell you anyway. And I mean, it's, so you'd been left to guess what the deals might have been, obviously, in terms of positions and so on. There's obviously a public manifestation of it. And I think it really, one of the things that was sort of striking during the long precursor of the Boyce debate, when Malcolm Turnbull eventually said no, he wouldn't go ahead with the recommendation that had come from both Uluru and then the Referendum Council, was to say no, that would be that would be creating a third chamber and it would be impossible and so on and so forth, which was pretty extraordinary given the sort of process that had gone on. And there was a lot of rumours at the time that said, was this part of the coalition deal? Was this part of what the Nats had said, you got to stand up for making sure that this doesn't get up? I don't know, because it remained confidential and Malcolm was never drawn on it, but it took him a long time after, when he was out of Parliament, to change his mind on that position. So I think that now we have Susan Lee talking about transparency being central to the process. Well, bring it on. That's good.
Yeah, because it's not something that we've had before. And part of the breakdown of the relationship over the last week, Frank, there had been some allusion to the fact that there was long-standing hostility between Lee and Littleproud because, of course, Lee represents a regional seat. And took it in a 3-cornered contest after the retirement of Tim Fischer. And so there had always been resentment that was actually a national seat.
Yes, and I think that does look to be one of the dynamics. It's sort of personal, but it's not really, because it's about rivalry between the Liberals and the Nationals for particular seats in regional areas. I mean, this issue came up, you might recall, with Murray. The seat of Murray, also a borderland seat, and Sharman Stone many years ago, who won it for the Liberal Party. I think it had been national, may have gone back to national afterwards. But it's very interesting, if you think about that kind of rivalry, that we now have a situation where the Liberals have roughly 10 seats that you'd more or less call metropolitan seats. They're not really, some of them. They're kind of suburban fringes. They wouldn't be classified as metropolitan by the Australian Electoral Commission, but that's basically where the Liberals are these days. They've basically been eradicated from most of the places, the big cities where people live. Now, one of the consequences of this is that the kind of scenario that you have in Farrer, in Susan Lay's seat, is now kind of generalised, where you've got the Nats and you've got the Liberals essentially competing potentially for the same seats. In fact, Tony talked about this in the interview with New England. Personally, as someone who was one of Tony's constituents for many years up there, I suspect the Liberals are less likely than another independent in due course. But the point is that you've essentially got the Liberals and the Nats now, or extending that to the LNP in Queensland, who are kind of competing for the same electorates. And I think that's potentially a dynamic that's going to become increasingly important, given what we've seen at the 2022 and 2025 elections.
Yeah, and I think, Tony also alluded to, a young Barnaby Joyce, but it does seem, Judy, that a lot of the issues that they've had around personality-based politics, without having a leader who has a gravitas from policy, you do get these sort of personalities posturing. So when Barnaby Joyce came in, it was very much as a populist. And so he was seeking to get, media coverage and generally build his profile by posturing. He's crossed the floor, I think, 82 times in his career. Canavan, who's sort of following in that same kind of mold, it's been 60. So from that point, really through to now, and we're seeing this play out with Bridget McKenzie, with now Jacinta Price, there's much more personality. There's no strength to try and gravitas to try and solve some of these problems. They're all just staking out their various positions.
Yes. So, that's, I'm not quite sure what the question is there. Sorry.
Well, I guess it's more, do you see that this sort of personality-based politics has been part of the reason for the downfall, if you like, of the Nationals in these recent weeks, and certainly the coalition in the last?
No, I suppose what I think has been going on is I don't think either the Liberals or the Nationals foresaw the size of the swing against them, and I think they're in a sort of panic mode.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't think, they're floundering. They don't really understand what's happened. They weren't anticipating this. They were probably anticipating, at worst, a minority government. I don't think they thought that they'd get back in. But this is, I just don't think they're even thinking very straight at the moment. And like Jacinta Price's behaviour has been pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I suppose the other thing I'd say is I think there's always, there's economic arguments, and then there's been the cultural arguments. And in a way, what Howard did, I think, very cleverly was, while he was busily bringing in neoliberal policies, which most of many National Party supporters didn't support at all, he jumped on the culture wars as a way of holding the so-called, making conservative values much more crucial to the electoral support of the party than they'd been. And, like, in a way, parties need personality retail politicians for recognition, but they also need people to do the policy work. So you're right. There hasn't been the policy work being done under Dutton on either side, and to a large extent, we didn't see much policy work being done by the Liberals, or the coalition, I should say, in the long period of government that they had up until 22.
What I did find surprising in the comments that Tony made was the suggestion, Julianne, that there had not just been the kind of betrayal of Boswell and Fisher and all the work they had done to try and sideline One Nation through preference deals and that kind of thing. But there had been in those last few weeks liaison around policy to try and hold on to any last vote and keep it within the rights ecosystem. I mean, I found that quite
I thought that was interesting the way he framed it. I mean, I think there's been a cozying up effectively to One Nation policies for a long time. I mean, I said before, Howard had his apparent criticism, but actually he allowed it to go. Obviously, the Nats had their own interest in closing off One Nation because that was where they were seeing their votes leaking to. So coming to this deal at this time, I think was part of a pattern which has actually been going on for a long time, and I think that it's worth just remembering it in terms of the sort of race has always been the catnip of the National Party in Queensland, and if there's ever an issue, you go to a racial finger pointing. So you saw it in the Queensland state election, where the only policy which really has had any particular resonance was adult time for kids doing adult time for crime, whatever it was, which is really a way of pointing to Aboriginal kids. That was that's who they were targeting. And that's been one of the few bits of legislation they've introduced. The other bit was to kill the treaty process, which had been well underway. Now, what was really interesting about that was that probably in the year of the referendum, 23, it was about March, April that year, I can't remember the exact date, Christopher Foley, as the leader of the LNP in Queensland, gave a very passionate speech in favour of the treaty process in Queensland. It was, we've got to do this, we've got to sort it out. It's been festering for so long. My party's been complicit in it, and so on. And June of that year, he goes to the National Party LNP conference in Queensland, and they say, we are not comfortable with you having said this in the Parliament. We want you out of this. And Chris Forley said, well, this is, we've given bipartisan support. It's going underway. And it took until the referendum to go down so spectacularly, particularly in Queensland, for Chris Forley to be able to come back when he's elected and say, oh, we've got to kill that. We're not going to do it. I think it was the second thing he did in office was to kill the treaty process. Not directly, through the media, not even having a direct conversation with Josh Creamer for weeks after he'd made the announcement. So it just goes that race is the catnip. And so what they saw during the Voice referendum was an extraordinary level of support because they were pushing those buttons, which are always there to be pushed in Queensland. And I think they thought that gave them, a way of cruising a bit. And clearly, it didn't work. But it also, just highlighted how thin that policy process was. Why would you be so, targeting such a weak part of the society? Why would you be making that such a sort of point of frisson? And actually, that didn't translate. I mean, Dutton tried it during the election campaign when he was doing, I won't stand in front of a flag and, don't do welcome to countries, honestly, marginal issues for the rest of Australia. But I think he was taking false comfort from what I describe as this catnip of Queensland politics.
Yeah, no, look, I think he definitely was. And so now you have a situation where you've got a re-elected Albanese government with this extraordinary majority, even if, as Alex Fine was saying last week, some of the votes that elected them as soft support, it was actually a vote against the paucity of what was on offer from the coalition. But nonetheless, it's now a huge majority. And this incredibly weakened, we don't even know if it's a coalition at the moment. So the notion of who is going to be holding Albanese and his government to account is a really open one. Is it going to be the crossbench? Will they get their act together at some point over the next few weeks? Frank, how do you think actually the mechanics of Parliament are going to work when Parliament resumes in July, given who's sitting in it and the power that they are or are not holding?
Well, Joe, I don't know, because we don't know whether that coalition's going to be reformed ahead of resumption of Parliament or the new Parliament. I mean, my guess is that it will. I think the situation at the moment would be a deeply damaging one for both the Liberals and the Nationals going forward. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. If they don't, if they basically go back to that parliament with the coalition broken, I mean, the distribution of parties will look a little bit like 1943. And I know that might sound a bit arcane, but it's a really important wartime election. It was Labor's biggest victory ever, one of the biggest landslides in Australian political history. And what you had on the right, facing the Labor Party and the sort of other 1/3 of the House of Representatives that Labor didn't hold was a kind of a group of splintered, fragmented, parties of the right. You had Country Party, you had various bits and pieces, the United Australia Party and Independence and all the rest of it. It'll look a little bit like that. I think it. I mean, I wrote a piece a few days ago in which I said I thought it would likely be a trial separation rather than a divorce, because I think the dynamics of this are very, very difficult for Littleproud to maintain. I mean, I think his leadership is very shaky. There's going to be, I think, enormous pressure within the party, not least to regain the kinds of material advantages in terms of support that you get from being a part of the coalition in opposition rather than a crossbench party. So my guess is they probably will head back in that direction, but who knows? We just don't know.
Judy, one of the things that Tony picked up on was that there would be panic amongst the donors who are seeing this rabble, and that whilst the parliamentary party has a role to play, the coalition behind the scenes is a lot of very powerful and very rich people who don't want to see their influence wane. Do you think that will have an impact on the discussions that take place in the next few days? And do you think that, given that Lee picked up the phone and spoke to McCormack, to Chester, I mean, if Barnaby Joyce is one of your party's elder statesmen, you know you probably are in trouble. Do you think the fact that that Lee went around Littleproud really has signed the death notice for his leadership?
Well, look, what I actually want to say is that the Labor Party Labor government does not control the Senate. And I think what we're going to see is the Senate. I mean, the Senate's been really important actually since the 1980s. And I think we're going to see the Senate becoming much, much more important. And that's where the real opposition will be. And that because Labor's going to have to negotiate all its bills except its money bills through the Senate. And so, I mean, I know, like, I've been thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. We won't have an opposition. They won't be held accountable, but they will be. They're not in the position that Howard was in 2000, before the 2007 election, when he could get everything through. So the fact that the coalition, the Nationals would lose its party status in the Senate, I think will be a real, in terms of what Frank's talking about, when they start to think about how is Parliament going to operate, where can we actually have some say. So, I don't have any insight into the donors of the National Party. That's the sort of thing Tony Windsor will. But I think we don't have to, people to act as if somehow the opposition is just in the lower house, but it's not. It'll be in the Senate, and the Greens are going to be extremely important there. But even if that the coalition didn't get back together, I mean, Labor would give Labor the opportunity to, for example, negotiate with the Nationals on some issues where the Nationals might have more left-wing views in terms of the role of government than the Liberals might. I mean, Gabrielle Chan had a piece in The Guardian where she was arguing, well, maybe they should stay apart for a while, and maybe the Nationals should actually be able to really think about how they best represent Australia. I mean, I don't think that's a particularly good strategy, because I think what would happen is that you'd get a lot more Cathy McGowans, that you'll get those country independents. So in terms of what's going to happen in the internal negotiations, I don't think it's going to matter much whether we've got David Littleproud or McCormack, or I don't think the personalities are going to actually have much say against the really large forces that have come through this election.
Yeah, and then just to finish up, Julianne, on that point about the Senate, I mean, Albanese now has an option where they can negotiate with the coalition to get their bills through, or they can negotiate with the Greens and that sort of solid progressive majority that exists. And it's going to be really interesting to see which way they go. And we've got this very important announcement coming up. Well, we thought it was actually going to be on Friday, but we haven't heard yet about the expansion of the Northwest Shelf gas reservation over in WA, and that really is going to be the first test, I think, for the progressive support of the Albanese government.
Look, I think that's right. I mean, as I wrote in The Guardian last week, I mean, I think that this is a historic moment. I mean, Frank talks about 1943. I think when you look at the world that we are now in terms of climate change, of the sort of having Trump sort of destabilizing global arrangements that have been in place for 80 years, the digital environment, increasing inequality. I mean, this is one of those big watershed moments, that I'm sure, in future we'll look back on, that trying to grapple with the change that the world has to face now is a huge challenge. Now, who knows what will happen with Northwest Shelf? I mean, I guess we can guess which way we think it'll go. But I do think that having a Senate, as Judy has said, that will be there, checking stuff. And actually, Labor's got options. It can deal, as you say, it can deal with the Nats, who are not a party. You can deal with the Liberal Party, you can deal with the Greens. I mean, David Pocock and others are in there as well. So, it's actually a very, it's quite a dynamic sort of situation. And my sense is that there are, that view that just like 1943, it wasn't just that war was happening, but the whole process of reconstruction was already well underway, in 1943, which actually set up, the changes in the economy and changes in society that played out over the next, 20 years or more. I think this potentially is a similar moment, and to not grasp this moment as for what it is, and to go back to the checklist of the little things that were on the election mandate, and actually go back to the really fundamental work that's been done. I mean, the fundamental work that was being done on tax, on climate, on meaningful Indigenous recognition, on the services sector. I mean, we are in a situation where the economy is overwhelmingly services funded by the state, but operated by private sector. I mean, it's sort of weird. We've got a university sector which was once absolutely up there, not just in terms of the economic importance and international importance, but in terms of building the capacity of Australian citizens. I mean, they're all really floundering at the moment. So there's a great sort of existential, I have to use the word existential moment, in terms of all of these things coming together with a government that's got a majority and a Senate that it will be able to negotiate with to actually grasp it, seems to me.
Yeah, and and a cabinet, and indeed a wider ministry and caucus full of interesting, intelligent, committed people. Hopefully, then, that will be given the freedom to think big in the next term, if not the next two terms.
Yeah, there doesn't seem in the analysis that's come out so far. I mean, there's no suggesting that the young people who've not voted for the coalition parties in any, in any numbers, are saying, "Oh, slow down. We don't want there to be more change." They're actually saying, "Actually, we're looking at you and we want you to do something."
Yeah. Well, look, that brings us to the end of another Sunday Shot. We thank the three of you very much for joining us. Before we go, we do give the opportunity, if there's any kind of top tip of anything which is really focusing your mind coming up in the next few days that you'd like to raise. Frank, is there anything which is causing you to focus intensely?
No, well, I know Barnaby Joyce has been ill, but I suspect we may be up to a point where we'll get a slightly more vigorous intervention around the National Party developments than we've had from him so far. So I think my tip would be, surely the time has come for Barnaby Joyce to have his say, and we can be reasonably certain it will be done in probably an idiosyncratic way, but let's wait and see.
Yeah, and kind of interesting that he is actually backing McCormack as well. There's very strange alliances which have been formed over the last few days. Judy, anything that you think will be of particular note in the coming week?
Well, I mean, if it looks like Tim Wilson holds Goldstein,
Yes.
I think it'll be interesting to see whether he repeats his attack on anything that affects baby boomers' retirement and takes on the superannuation changes that Chalmers is bringing into the parliament.
I think he's gearing up to do just that and had to take a step back when all of a sudden the seat was a little bit kind of back in play. Although I think that one has now been resolved, alas, for Wilson. But Bradfield, of course, goes on the knife edge. Julianne.
Well, I was just thinking in relation to my comments about the sort of race being the catnip of Queensland politics, and it's less about the sort of political play, but more about the sort of cultural activities that might be of interest to people who are watching this. And that is to note that the huge exhibition at the Potter Gallery in Melbourne, 65,000 years, a short history of Aboriginal art or Indigenous art, is opening this weekend. It's an extraordinary exhibition, and if you're looking for something else to do to stretch your mind a bit, I would encourage people to go along.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Get down to the Potter Gallery. Thank you all very much for watching. We do appreciate it. We hope you'll tune in again next week as ever. Help the gods of the algorithms by liking and subscribing and doing all those things. And also, if you'd like to keep us on air, you might want to throw a few dollars our way, and you can do that by following the links or the QR code at the end. Thank you again. And next week, it's going to be all about Europe.